Hi guys, welcome to another video, and in this video I'm going to discuss my favourite lens for documentary photography, or perhaps more accurately my preferred focal length for this kind of photography. But first of all, what exactly do I mean by documentary photography? Well, according to Wikipedia, documentary photography usually refers to a popular form of photography used to chronicle events or environments both significant and relevant to history and historical events as well as everyday life. Now, my main subject for documentary photography is undoubtedly weddings, and for this I need a small discreet lens which I can use in a variety of situations, including low light, with a minimum fuss, which is why I much prefer to use prime lenses for wedding photography as opposed to zoom lenses, as they tend to not only be smaller, but they also are normally a lot faster, such as f1.4, f1.8, i.e. they let in lots of light. Now when I'm photographing weddings, I actually like to use two different camera bodies with two different prime lenses. So on one camera body there would be a semi-wide prime lens, and on the other camera there would be a short telephoto. And that means I essentially can cover, obviously from a semi-wide to short telephoto, easy just by choosing the camera body, but still have those light gathering advantages of using a prime lens. It also acts as a backup, because I could of course just use one camera body and a 2.8 zoom, but that would be heavier. People will notice you far more when you take a photo with it, and also it will be slower, so it doesn't let as much light in. And of course there's a big problem that if that camera body should break, I don't have another camera body on hand to use. So if I'm using two prime lenses on two camera bodies, I'm pretty much covered for everything I need to do throughout a wedding. But what about if I wasn't in a wedding situation but I still want to do documentary style photography, think street photography perhaps? What about if I could only have one prime lens? What would that focal length be? Now that for me would be a really easy choice, and I would always choose a 35mm focal length lens, or a 35mm equivalent if using micro four thirds or APS-C, of course. Now I find that focal length to be perfect to use for a walk around lens. It's wide enough if you want to use landscapes with it, but it's also not so wide that you can't use it for portraits. So basically it's a good all-rounder. So perhaps it's not surprising that when Fujifilm designed their ever popular range of X100 fixed lens cameras, that they chose a 23mm focal length, which of course is 35mm in full frame equivalent, because the X100 has an APS-C sensor. It is a very versatile walk around focal length, and I think this is proved by Fujifilm's choice. Now there are two other common focal lengths used by photographers for documentary photography of this style. Probably the most common one is the 50mm so-called standard prime lens. Now this is supposed to be the focal length which basically resembles our own sight as such, our own field of view that we see. I don't know, I don't get on with the 50mm lens. I find it a little bit restrictive. If I'm being blunt, I'm finding it a little bit boring. It's a very natural focal length, but I find it very hard to try and include any environment into my shots with it. And I find in a wedding environment, I'm a little bit disjointed because I'm out of the action a little bit. And with a 35mm, I can sort of get into it a little bit more. So I'm afraid I struggle to see in 50mm. But it's a good starting point, I think. If you're picking up your first ever prime lens and you want to try just walking around with one prime lens, the fact that a 50mm lens is so cheap to buy, I think pretty much any camera manufacturer has a cheap nifty 50 as such for sale, which will be a lot cheaper than a 35mm. And I think it is a good prime lens to sort of experiment with, but for me it's not a focal length I can get on with. And the other option, which is actually used by the Leica Q range of cameras, which whilst being very expensive are also very popular, and that's 28mm. So for me 28mm it's quite nice, but it's a bit too wide, and what I find I have to do is I have to crop to essentially get myself to the 35mm. And if I'm in a wedding environment, and I have used a 28mm lens quite a few times in weddings, I find I have to be really straight in the action, and I feel like I'm in everybody's face, and it just isn't for me. So, but really, those are the three most popular focal lengths that I use. So that's your 28mm, your 35mm, and your 50mm. So as you can see just by the figures, the 35mm is the sweet spot between the three of them. Now at this point, you may be thinking it's just easier to use a zoom lens when you're out and about with your camera. You know, you cover various focal lengths, you have the convenience of a zoom. Life is easy. And I think that's the whole point why you should try using a prime lens, because a prime lens will restrict your photography. And generally in photography, restrictions are a good thing. Now, if you're out and about for the day and you've only got one focal length with you, what you will quickly learn to do is you will quickly learn to use your feet to zoom in and out, and to actually get closer to your subject or further away as required. Now a lot of the time with a zoom, there's a temptation to just twist your zoom to zoom in maximum and just take your photo. When the reality is, if you just walk closer to it, the whole perspective would change between your subject and the background behind the image, and that whole composition can just change like that simply by you walking a couple of steps forward or a couple of steps back, and you just don't get that same effect with a zoom lens. And what you will find over time is you'll start to learn how to see in that focal length. Now I mentioned earlier that I don't get on with 50mm because I don't see in 50mm. But the reality is, if I practiced more with 50mm, I would probably start to see more in 50mm. It's all about how you learn to see, how you interpret the world, and recognising how your camera is going to record that scene. So by just concentrating on one focal length, you can get to really nail down your compositions and how you want to make your own pictures. Now, as I said earlier, in an ideal world, if I was shooting a wedding, I would have a 35mm and an 85mm lens. And the same applies for if I was shooting landscapes with prime lenses. I would probably like to have a 35mm and an 85mm again for exactly the same reasons, because it's nice to have a little bit of a telephoto reach. And sometimes zooming with your feet as such is never going to actually be the same as actually having more magnification. For the same reason that as you walk closer to a subject, that whole perspective will change. And sometimes you just need to be able to magnify it more. So I'm not really suggesting that you just shoot one focal length all of your life, even though some photographers do, and some photographers produce amazing results doing just that. But I do think it's worthwhile experimenting with a prime lens, trying a classic documentary focal length out, either 28mm, 35mm or 50mm, whichever you prefer. 35mm is my poison. But one thing I can guarantee you, it is going to help you understand your photography more, it will improve your compositions, and it will ultimately make you a better photographer. Anyway guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. Maybe subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and I'll see you next week for another one. Thanks for watching.